What if Grayfia fell in love with Issei? Dxd HAREM FIC. The underworld had always known Grayfia Lucifuge as perfection given form. She was elegance sharpened into a weapon, silver hair bound with discipline, crimson eyes reflecting absolute loyalty, and a presence that commanded silence even among the highest-ranking devils. As Lucifer's queen, as Serzek's Lucifer's wife, she was order, composure, and restraint incarnate. Or at least, that was who she was supposed to be. Grayfia did not remember the last time her heart had beaten irregularly. Devils spoke of love as contracts, marriages as alliances, emotions as indulgences to be managed. Grayfia had accepted this long ago. Her marriage to Serzek was respectful, politically perfect, and emotionally distant. Not cruel. Not cold. Simply hollow. A union forged by duty, not desire. She had believed that was enough, until Issei entered her world. It began during a joint training exercise between the Gremry peerage and elite underworld observers. Grayfia attended in her capacity as an overseer, standing beside Serzek on a high balcony overlooking the training grounds. Her attention was professional, evaluating magic output, teamwork, and control. And then Issei nearly died. It was reckless, idiotic, and entirely in character. A high-tier summoned opponent went berserk, its magic destabilizing beyond expected parameters. The barrier faltered. Panic rippled across the field. Before any high-ranking devil could intervene, Issei moved. He pushed Rias aside. Not with strategy. Not with calculation. Pure instinct. His body burned crimson as boosted gear roared to life, scales tearing through flesh, bones screaming under the pressure of power his body still wasn't meant to handle. He didn't retreat. He didn't hesitate. He stood between the threat and his comrades like a shield made of will alone. Grayfia felt it then. Not fear, recognition. His magic was chaotic, unrefined, but his intent was absolute. Protect. Even if it destroyed him. The attack hit him full force. The explosion tore the field apart. Smoke and shattered stone filled the air. Devils shouted. Rias screamed his name. Grayfia moved before she realized she had decided to. She vanished from the balcony and reappeared at ground zero, her silver hair whipping violently as she knelt beside Issei's broken body. His armor flickered, cracked, fading, blood soaked into the stone beneath him. His breathing was shallow, uneven. Serzek arrived seconds later, but by then Grayfia's hands were already glowing with healing magic. Her hands trembled. That alone should have terrified her. She poured power into him far beyond what was necessary, far beyond what was proper. She ignored the watching devils, ignored protocol, ignored even Serzek's quiet call of her name. Live! She whispered, a word she had never spoken with desperation before. Issei coughed, gasping as his chest rose sharply. His eyes fluttered open, unfocused, then slowly found her face. As Silver, Angel! He muttered weakly. She should have corrected him. She didn't. Instead, something warm and unfamiliar bloomed in her chest. Relief. In the days that followed, Grayfia found excuses to see him. Medical evaluations. Mana stability checks. Observations of the boosted gear's recovery. Each reason was valid. Each visit was unnecessary. Issei, for his part, treated her with the same blunt honesty he treated everyone else with. No fear, no reverence. He thanked her. He joked, even while bandaged. He apologized for worrying everyone, his guilt genuine. When she scolded him, he accepted it with a sheepish grin. When she praised him, he flushed like a teenager, which he was. It was absurd. And yet, she found herself looking forward to those moments. She listened when he spoke, not about power or ambition, but about wanting to protect his friends, about fearing he wasn't strong enough yet, about loving deeply and without restraint. He spoke of Rias with loyalty, of his peerage with devotion, of women with embarrassing honesty and surprising sincerity. He desired openly. Grayfia had denied herself silently, one evening, as she prepared to leave after yet another checkup. Issei spoke before she could teleport away. Hey! Grayfia-sama? She turned. Thank you? For saving me. And for coming back. You didn't have to, you know. She studied him for a long moment. No, she said quietly. I did. That night, Grayfia lay beside Serzek in silence, staring at the ceiling of their chambers. Her husband slept peacefully, unaware of the storm forming within her heart. For the first time in centuries, Grayfia Lucifuge felt something dangerous. Not temptation, not curiosity, love. And love, she knew, would destroy everything if left unchecked. But as Issei's smile lingered in her thoughts, she realized something far more frightening. She didn't want to stop it. Grayfia Lucifuge had faced gods, monsters, and beings whose mere presence shattered worlds. None of them had ever unsettled her like this. She stood alone on a high balcony of the Lucifer estate, the underworld's crimson sky stretching endlessly before her. The wind tugged at her silver hair, cold and sharp, yet she barely felt it. Her thoughts were not on diplomacy, not on governance, not on the endless responsibilities she had carried since childhood. They were on Issei Hayato. That, in itself, was unacceptable. Grayfia prided herself on discipline. Every emotion she allowed herself was measured, categorized, and controlled. She had lived centuries mastering restraint because restraint was survival in the political ecosystem of the underworld. Desire created weakness. Attachment invited exploitation. And yet, since that day on the battlefield, her control had begun to fracture. She could still feel the warmth of his magic beneath her palms when she healed him, raw, blazing, alive. Unlike the refined, orderly power of high-ranking devils, Issei's energy was emotional, responsive. It surged when he felt fear, exploded when he felt resolve, and burned brightest when he thought of protecting others. It reminded her of something she had long forgotten: freedom. Behind her, the balcony doors opened softly. Grayfia. Surzek's voice was gentle, as it always was. She turned, composing herself instantly. Her posture straightened, her expression neutral, her aura controlled. If there was any sign of turmoil within her, she buried it deep, where it belonged. "You should be resting," she said calmly. "Tomorrow's council session will be long." Surzek smiled faintly. "I could say the same to you." He joined her at the railing, his presence familiar, comforting in its predictability. For a moment, they stood together in silence, watching the distant lights of the underworld. "You've been visiting the Gremory territory often," he said at last, not accusing, observant. Her fingers tightened slightly against the stone railing. "I am overseeing Issei Hayato's recovery," she replied. "His sacred gear continues to evolve at an abnormal rate. It warrants attention." Surzek nodded. "I agree. He's remarkable." There was warmth in his tone. Pride. Amusement. Grayfia waited for something more: suspicion, concern, jealousy. It didn't come. "He reminds me of you in a way," Surzek continued. "Reckless when it matters. Willing to shoulder burdens that aren't his to bear." Her heart skipped once, sharp and traitorous. "He is nothing like you," she said too quickly. Surzek glanced at her, mildly surprised, then chuckled. "I suppose not." That night, Grayfia could not sleep. Her mind replayed Issei's voice, his laughter, the way he looked at her without calculation or fear. He didn't see the Queen of Hell, the embodiment of Lucifer's authority. He saw a woman, and that was the problem. The next time she saw him, it was not in a sterile medical chamber, or an official observation room. It was in the Gremory household kitchen. She had arrived unannounced, intending only a brief evaluation. Instead, she found Issei standing at the stove in casual clothes, sleeves rolled up, hair messy, humming off-key while attempting to cook. The smell was questionable. He turned when he sensed her presence, eyes widening slightly before breaking into a grin. "Grayfia-sama! This isn't what it looks like." She looked at the pan, then at the faint scorch marks on the counter. "It looks like you are attempting to commit culinary suicide," she said flatly. He laughed, completely unashamed. "Yeah, Asia banned me from the kitchen, but I thought I'd surprise everyone." Against her will, the corner of her lips lifted. Just barely. He noticed. That realization sent a strange thrill through her. They sat at the table moments later, not as overseer and subject, not as queen and servant, but simply as two people. He talked. She listened. About training, about his fears, about how overwhelming it was to stand among devils of noble blood when he was still, at heart, a human boy who had died for love once already. "I don't really care about status," he admitted, scratching his cheek. "If someone's important to me, that's all that matters." The words struck her harder than any attack. Important. No one had ever said that to Grayfia Lucifuge without an agenda. She realized then that the danger was no longer theoretical. She wanted him, not as an indulgence, not as a fleeting curiosity, but as something more. That night, as she left the Gremry territory, she felt it clearly, an undeniable pull between their souls. The boosted gear reacted faintly to her presence, its dragon stirring not in hostility, but in recognition. A bond was forming, one that would not be ignored, and elsewhere, in the depths of the underworld's political web, eyes began to notice. High-ranking devils whispered of Grayfia's unusual behavior. Rias Gremry, perceptive and sharp, watched the interaction with growing concern and understanding. Even Surzex, gentle as he was, began to sense the shift in the air around his wife. A shift that could change the balance of hell itself. Because if Grayfia Lucifuge chose love over restraint, the underworld would have to adapt. And Issei Haedu, unknowingly, was standing at the center of a storm that would redefine devils, marriage, and power itself. Grayfia Lucifuge did not lose control. She released it. That was how she justified the moment her composure finally cracked. It happened during a closed council session in the highest chamber of the underworld, where only Satans, their queens, and the oldest noble houses were permitted to stand. The air was thick with authority and ancient magic, every word spoken weighed against centuries of tradition. Grayfia stood at Surzek's side as always, calm, composed, perfect. Until Issei Haedu's name was spoken. The Red Dragon Emperor's growth rate has surpassed projected limits, one of the elders said, his voice sharp with calculation. His influence is no longer localized. He represents a destabilizing variable. Grayfia's fingers tightened imperceptibly. Which is why he must be brought under stricter control. Another added. Increased oversight. Restricted autonomy. Perhaps even binding oaths. That was when she felt it. A flare. Not from the council chamber, but from Issei. The boosted gear resonated across distance and wards alike, responding to her emotional spike. Power trembled in the air, unnoticed by most, but unmistakable to her senses. Without thinking, she spoke. No, the single word cut through the chamber like a blade. Every eye turned to her. Surzex looked surprised, but not displeased. The Red Dragon Emperor has repeatedly demonstrated loyalty, restraint, and self-sacrifice. Grayfia continued, her voice steady but carrying an edge none could ignore. To shackle such an asset would be foolish. You do not control strength like his, you earn it. Murmurs rippled through the chamber. One of the elders frowned. Your defense seems personal, Lady Grayfia. Silence. For a heartbeat too long, Grayfia said nothing. Then she inclined her head slightly. It is informed. The session ended shortly thereafter, but the damage was done. By the time she returned to the Lucifer estate, the weight of what she had done settled heavily upon her shoulders. She had crossed the line, not publicly, not openly, but unmistakably. She had revealed bias. She stood alone in her chambers, hands resting against the cold windowpane, when the door opened. Rias Gremry stepped inside. Grayfia turned slowly. Lady Rias, she said. To what do I owe? Please, Rias interrupted gently. Just Rias. Not tonight. There was no accusation in her voice. Only quiet resolve. Rias approached, crimson eyes studying Grayfia not as a noble, not as a devil princess, but as a woman. You care for him, Rias said. It was not a question. Grayfia closed her eyes. Yes. The word felt like both a confession and a liberation. Rias exhaled slowly, as if she had been holding her breath for weeks. I thought so. There was no anger. No jealousy. Only understanding, and pain. I love him, Rias continued. Deeply. I won't pretend otherwise. But Issei has always had a heart too big for one bond. I knew that when I chose him. Grayfia opened her eyes stunned. Then why come here? Because I needed to hear it from you, Rias replied. And because the underworld will not forgive secrets between women like us. They stood in silence, tension thick but not hostile. I would never harm him, Grayfia said quietly. Or take what is not freely given, Rias smiled faintly. Then you're already doing better than most devils. Elsewhere, Surzex stood alone in the council chamber long after everyone had departed. He replayed the session in his mind, every inflection of Grayfia's voice, every subtle shift in her aura. He was not foolish. He loved his wife, not as a possession, not as a symbol, but as a person. And he knew that what she felt now was not betrayal. It was awakening. When Grayfia returned that night, she found him waiting. "I won't ask if it's true," Sirzex said gently. "I already know." Her throat tightened. "I never intended." "I know," he interrupted. "That's why it hurts." They faced each other in silence. After a long moment, Sirzex spoke again. "Does he know?" "No." "Does he return it?" "I don't know." Sirzex closed his eyes briefly, then opened them with quiet resolve. "Then we will not decide this in fear. We will decide it honestly." The next day, Grayfia found Issei alone in the training grounds, sweat-soaked and exhausted, still pushing himself despite his injuries. She stepped into his field of vision. He froze. "Grayfia-sama?" For the first time since she had known him, she hesitated. "I need to speak with you," she said. "Not as Lucifer's queen. Not as an overseer." His heart began to race, and he didn't know why. "As a woman." The air between them shifted. Issei swallowed hard. "Oh, okay." And in that moment, everything changed. Because whatever words came next would shatter old laws, redefine bonds, and pull the Red Dragon Emperor into a future where love was no longer singular, but shared, powerful, and dangerous. Grayfia Lucifuge had stood before executioners without fear, yet standing before Issei Hayato, alone on the training grounds beneath the crimson underworld sky, her heartbeat was louder than thunder. He wiped sweat from his brow, boosted gear fading as he turned fully toward her. There was no bravado in his eyes now, only uncertainty, concern, and an instinctive awareness that this conversation mattered. "You said, as a woman?" Issei said slowly. "Did I do something wrong?" "No," Grayfia replied immediately. "You did nothing wrong. This is my burden to bear." She stepped closer. Not invading his space, respecting it, but near enough that he could feel the shift in the air, the subtle pressure of her aura no longer restrained by titles or duty. "For centuries," she continued, "I lived believing emotions were tools to be mastered or discarded. Love was a concept, not a necessity. Marriage was order. Loyalty was structure." She met his eyes. "Then you nearly died protecting others without hesitation." Issei stiffened. "I just did what anyone should." "No," she said softly. "You did what you would do. And that is what changed everything." Her hand rose, then stopped, hovering between them. She did not touch him. "I care for you, Issei Hayato," Grayfia said. "Not as an asset. Not as a symbol. But as a person who awakened something I believed long dead." His breath caught. The boosted gear stirred, its gem glowing faintly, not aggressively, but warmly, like recognition. "You don't have to answer now," she added. "And I will accept any choice you make. I will not chain you with obligation." Issei's thoughts were chaos. Grayfia Lucifuge, the queen of hell, the embodiment of composure, standing before him, vulnerable. I respect you," he said honestly. "A lot. You saved my life. You believed in me when others talked about controlling me." "But Rias, my friends, I know," Grayfia replied. "And that is why this must be decided openly." As if summoned by fate itself, a familiar presence manifested behind them. Sirzex Lucifer appeared in a pillar of light. Issei nearly jumped out of his skin. "A Lucifer-sama?" Sirzex raised a hand calmly. "Relax. This is not a trial." He looked at Grayfia, not with anger, not with resentment, but with a quiet sadness and unwavering respect. "Issei Hayato," Sirzex said, "I will be direct. My wife has spoken the truth. And I will do the same." Issei swallowed hard. "Our marriage was built on duty," Sirzex continued. "It was never cruel, never false, but it was never complete. Grayfia gave me loyalty. I gave her stability. What neither of us gave was choice." He turned fully toward Issei. "If you choose to reject her, nothing changes. If you choose to accept her feelings, then the consequences will be shared by all of us." Issei clenched his fists. "I don't want anyone to get hurt," he said. "I never wanted power to ruin lives." Sirzex smiled faintly. "Then you are exactly the kind of man who should be given that choice." The air shifted again. Rias Gremory stepped forward from the edge of the grounds, her expression calm but resolute. "I won't pretend this is easy," she said, looking at Issei. "But I chose you knowing your heart isn't small. If Grayfia chooses you, then we face it together." Issei looked between them, three figures who shaped the underworld, all waiting on him. For the first time since becoming the Red Dragon Emperor, he understood the weight of his influence. "I don't know what the future looks like," he said slowly. "But I know one thing." He turned to Grayfia. "I don't want you to go back to living without choice." Her eyes widened slightly. "If walking forward means changing the rules," he continued, "then I'll walk carefully. Honestly. With everyone's consent." The boosted gear flared once. Bright, controlled, resonant. Surzex exhaled. Rias smiled softly. Grayfia felt something inside her finally settle. Not possession, not victory, but hope. Because this was no longer a forbidden feeling. It was a path. And once Issei Hayato began walking a path, the world had a habit of reshaping itself around him. The underworld did not change quietly. When the notice went out that a closed, high-level convocation had been called under Lucifer's authority, every noble house understood that something unprecedented was about to be discussed. Ancient sigils lit the great assembly hall, wards layered upon wards to ensure secrecy. Only Satans, their queens, clan heads, and select witnesses were permitted. Issei Hayato stood at the center of it all. He wore no ceremonial armor, no noble regalia. Just his usual attire, posture straight but shoulders tense, surrounded by beings who had ruled hell long before he was born. Rias stood to his right, calm and dignified. Grayfia stood to his left, composed once more, but different. Not colder. Not distant. Resolved. Surzex rose from his throne, his presence commanding instant silence. "This session exists to address a deviation from tradition," he said evenly. "Not a crime." Murmurs rippled through the chamber. "A Red Dragon Emperor," an elder said, voice edged with disdain, "forming sanctioned bonds with multiple high-ranking devils threatens the balance of—" "The balance has already changed," Surzex interrupted, calmly but firmly. "We are not here to pretend otherwise." Grayfia stepped forward. For the first time in recorded underworld history, the Queen of Lucifer addressed the council not as an extension of her husband, but as herself. "I request recognition of a voluntary, consensual multibond," she said. "One formed without coercion, manipulation, or political leverage." Her gaze swept the room. "And I submit myself to the same scrutiny as Issei Hayato." That stunned them. Rias followed, her voice steady. "House Gremory supports this petition. Not because of love alone, but because Issei has proven that his bonds strengthen, not weaken, those tied to him." Evidence was presented. Combat records. Crisis responses. Instances where Issei's emotional connections amplified his power in controlled, measurable ways. The Red Dragon Emperor's strength did not fracture loyalty. It consolidated it. And then, something unexpected happened. The boosted gear resonated. A low, steady hum filled the chamber, its gem glowing through Issei's chest as if responding to the weight of the moment. Power did not erupt. It synchronized. A calm, unified pressure settled across the hall. Even the elders felt it. "This," Surzex said quietly, "is the future you fear." Silence followed. At last, the verdict was rendered, not unanimous, but sufficient. Conditional recognition. Monitored legitimacy. A sanctioned bond, bound by consent, transparency, and accountability. History was rewritten with a clause. When the session ended, Issei felt like he had survived a battle more exhausting than any fight. Later, away from the eyes of hell, the four of them stood together in a quiet chamber. Rias exhaled first. "Well, that went better than expected," Issei laughed weakly. "I think I almost passed out." Grayfia looked at him then, not as a queen, not as a symbol, but as a woman who had chosen her path. "You stood your ground," she said. "Without arrogance. Without fear." "I was terrified," he admitted, her lips curved faintly. "Courage is not the absence of fear." In the days that followed, change came in subtler forms. Grayfia began appearing at the Gremory household not as an overseer, but as a presence, sharing meals, observing training, offering guidance without command. She learned the rhythms of Issei's life, his reckless determination, his exhaustion, his quiet moments of doubt, and Issei learned hers. He saw the weight she carried, the expectations she had lived under, the way she hesitated before allowing herself even small comforts. He did not try to fix it. He simply made space for her. There was no rush, no claiming, only trust being built, piece by piece. One evening, as they stood together on a balcony overlooking the underworld, Grayfia spoke softly. "I do not know what I will become in this new role," she said. "Only that I will not retreat from it." Issei nodded. "Then, we'll figure it out together." Below them, hell burned as it always had, ancient, dangerous, alive. But above it, something new had taken root. Not domination, not indulgence, but a bond strong enough to force even the underworld to adapt. And this was only the beginning. The reaction was not confined to the underworld. When word of the sanctioned multibond reached the supernatural world beyond hell's borders, it spread like wildfire through factions that had spent millennia watching devils fracture themselves through ambition and excess. Angels debated morality. Fallen angels debated leverage. Gods debated precedent. And enemies debated opportunity. Issei Hayato felt the shift before anyone explained it to him. Missions became more frequent. Surveillance increased. Conversation stopped when he entered rooms. Not out of hostility, but calculation. He was no longer just the Red Dragon Emperor. He was a nexus. A convergence of authority, power, and emotional alignment that did not fit neatly into any existing hierarchy. Grayfia noticed it immediately. She adjusted her presence around him subtly, never smothering, never dominating, but always aware. Where once she had observed the world from behind Lucifer's shadow, she now stood openly beside Issei, her aura no longer restrained to ceremonial limits. It unsettled people, especially those who remembered what Grayfia Lucifuge was capable of when she stopped holding back. The first test came without warning. A joint patrol near the border between the underworld and a neutral divine domain went wrong when space itself twisted open, reality tearing like cloth. From the rift emerged creatures that did not belong to any recognized faction, beings of distorted divinity, warped by failed experiments in artificial godhood. Issei barely had time to react before the pressure hit. This was not a test of brute force. It was a test of balance. The creatures attacked not his body, but his bonds. Illusions manifested mid-battle, whispering doubts, fears, insecurities. Rias felt her resolve strained. Others staggered. Issei clenched his teeth, forcing his power down instead of letting it explode. "Partner!" Drake's voice rumbled within him. "This enemy feeds on instability. Control is victory." Then Grayfia stepped forward. Her magic unfurled not as annihilation, but as structure, silver sigils locking space into place. Her power forming a stabilizing lattice around Issei's raging aura. She did not overpower him, she aligned with him. For the first time, the boosted gear did not roar. It harmonized. Power flowed cleanly, efficiently, devastatingly precise. Issei moved without hesitation, every strike backed by absolute clarity. The enemies shattered, not screaming, not resisting, simply erased. When the rift closed, silence fell. Those present understood immediately what they had witnessed. This was not dependency. This was synchronization. Later, as healers tended to minor injuries, Rias approached Grayfia quietly. "You didn't protect him," she said. "You balanced him." Grayfia inclined her head. "He does the same for me." That realization spread faster than fear ever could. In the days that followed, reports surfaced, whispers of a coalition forming in the shadows. Old gods who resented change. Rogue factions who feared the precedent Issei represented. Forces that believed cutting out the center of this new structure would cause everything to collapse. They were wrong. Issei felt the pressure mounting, but instead of isolating himself, he leaned into the very bonds they sought to exploit. Training sessions became shared efforts. Decisions were discussed, not dictated. Grayfia stood beside him in council halls not as a shield, but as an equal. One evening, after a long day of preparation, they stood together overlooking the training grounds. "They will come again," Grayfia said calmly. "Stronger. Smarter," Issei nodded. "Then we'll be ready." She studied him for a long moment before speaking again. "You have changed the nature of power, Issei Hayato. Not by conquering, but by connecting." He scratched his cheek, embarrassed. "I just didn't want to lose anyone." That, she realized, was what truly terrified their enemies. Because a man who fought for dominance could be predicted. A man who fought for people could not. Far beyond the underworld, ancient eyes opened, focusing on the Red Dragon Emperor and the Queen who had stepped out of the shadows for him. The next conflict would not be a skirmish, it would be a declaration, and when it came, it would test not just Issei's strength, but whether this new kind of bond could withstand the weight of gods who refused to adapt. The attack came without warning, without declaration, and without mercy. The sky above the underworld fractured like glass. Not a rift, an overwrite. Reality bent inward as ancient authority pressed down, the kind that did not announce itself with noise or spectacle, but with inevitability. Devils across territories froze as their instincts screamed the same message. This was not a raid. It was judgment. Issei Hayato felt it mid-step, his body locking as the pressure slammed into his core. The boosted gear flared violently, Drake's presence surging to the forefront. Partner! The dragon growled, voice grim. This is God-tier authority. Multiple sources. Coordinated. Before Issei could respond, the first strike hit. A column of blinding force descended from the shattered sky, erasing everything it touched. Mountains vaporized. Defensive barriers collapsed like paper. Entire sections of the borderlands ceased to exist, and at the center of it, Issei stood his ground. Grayfia was beside him instantly. She did not ask. She did not hesitate. Her magic unfolded fully for the first time in centuries. The seals that had bound her power, not external restrictions, but self-imposed limits, shattered silently. Silver-black sigils spiraled outward, locking space, time, and causality into her control radius. The air itself stabilized under her will. The annihilation strike bent, not redirected, denied. Shock rippled across the battlefield as figures emerged from the fractured sky. Beings of divine lineage, old gods and constructs of artificial divinity, their forms radiant and alien. At their center hovered a towering presence, eyes like burning suns fixed squarely on Issei. The convergence must be undone, it intoned. The bond is an aberration. Issei stepped forward, power rolling off him in controlled waves. You don't get to decide that. The god's gaze shifted to Grayfia. You were ordered. Bound. Loyal. Grayfia's voice was calm, deadly calm. I was, she said. I am not anymore. She moved, not as support, as a combatant. The battlefield transformed into a storm of motion and power. Issei struck with focused ferocity, every blow precise, amplified by emotional equilibrium rather than rage. Rias and the others joined seamlessly, their movements coordinated not by command, but trust. And Grayfia was terrifying. Her magic did not explode. It ended things. Divine constructs unraveled under her control, their authority stripped, their existence rewritten into nothingness. Gods who had ruled pantheons staggered as she dismantled their spells mid-formation, her mastery absolute. One god-tier adversary broke through, aiming directly for Issei's heart. Grayfia intercepted it barehanded. The impact cracked the sky. For a heartbeat, everything froze. Then she spoke, voice resonating across dimensions. He is not your linchpin, she said. He is your mistake. She released her grip. The god shattered. Silence followed, heavy, stunned, irrevocable. The remaining attackers retreated, not routed, but reconsidering. They had expected instability. They had expected fractures. They had found unity. When the sky sealed itself shut and the pressure lifted, Issei finally exhaled, knees buckling slightly. Grayfia caught him without thought, steadying him with a hand at his back. You didn't have to do that, he said quietly. Yes, she replied, meeting his gaze. I did. Across the underworld, the message was received loud and clear. This was no temporary deviation. This was a new axis of power. Later, as the wounded were tended and the dead honored, Sirzek stood before the assembled forces, his voice carrying authority sharpened by certainty. The underworld has chosen, he declared. We will not dismantle bonds that strengthen us. We will not bow to gods who fear change. The response was unanimous. Grayfia stood beside Issei as hell itself aligned behind them, not out of obligation, but belief. And far beyond their sight, in realms where even gods whispered instead of spoke, ancient beings took note. The Red Dragon Emperor had not conquered. He had united. And the queen who once stood in shadow now stood openly at his side, not as a symbol of order, but as proof that even hell could evolve. The war was not over, but the world would never be the same. The battlefield was silent long before the echoes of divine retreat faded from memory. Ash drifted across the ruined borderlands of the underworld, settling over scorched stone and fractured ley lines. Devils moved among the debris in disciplined formations, tending the wounded, recovering relics, rebuilding barriers. This was not chaos. It was response, measured, coordinated, resolute. Issei Hayate watched it all from a rise overlooking the devastation, arms resting on his knees, breath slow but heavy. The boosted gear had receded, its presence quiet but alert, like a sentinel that had learned restraint. For the first time since the attack, the weight of what had happened truly settled in. They really came to erase us, he said quietly. Grayfia stood beside him, cloak stirring in the wind. Her aura was contained once more, but those who knew what they had witnessed would never forget what lay beneath that calm surface. Yes, she replied. And they failed. Issei glanced at her. Because of you. She did not deny it. Nor did she accept it alone. Because of alignment, she corrected. Because no one stood alone. Across the underworld, that truth was already reshaping policy and perception. Emergency councils were convened. Treaties quietly revised. Surveillance doctrines rewritten. For the first time in generations, Hell did not posture defensively. It organized proactively. Sirzex Lucifer addressed the Greater Assembly the following day, his tone firm, his authority absolute. We have crossed a threshold, he declared. The old structures were designed to prevent collapse. What we witnessed proved they are no longer sufficient. There was no dissent. Grayfia's role was formally redefined, not stripped of authority, but clarified. She was no longer only the Queen of Lucifer, bound to protocol and shadowed execution. She was designated a high arbiter of stability, an open role that acknowledged her independence, her combat authority, and her chosen bonds. It was unprecedented. It was accepted. When she returned to the Gremry territory that evening, she did so without escort, without ceremony. The household was quieter than usual, the tension of recent days settling into something reflective. Issei found her on the veranda, standing alone, watching the artificial stars drift across the sky. You should be resting, he said, echoing words she had once spoken to him. She looked at him, a faint smile touching her lips. So should you. They stood together in comfortable silence for a time. I didn't know who I'd be after all this, Grayfia said at last. For centuries, my identity was defined by function. What I did. What I enforced. And now? Issei asked. No, she said thoughtfully. I choose. The simplicity of the word carried more weight than any declaration. Within the household, adjustments continued, not without friction, not without moments of hesitation. Bonds deepened through conversation rather than claim. Trust was built deliberately. Jealousy surfaced, acknowledged, addressed. No one was erased. No one was diminished. Issei learned quickly that leadership was not about being the strongest presence in the room, but about listening when strength was not required. And Grayfia learned something equally profound. That vulnerability, when chosen, was not weakness. Elsewhere, far beyond the mapped realms of devils, angels, and gods, something ancient stirred. Not a pantheon, not a deity, but a principle. An intelligence bound to order itself, observing the anomaly that had emerged. Not a singular power, but a convergence capable of redefining equilibrium. It did not rage. It did not fear. It calculated. And its conclusion was simple. If bonds could create power without hierarchy, then hierarchy itself was obsolete. Which meant the system had to be corrected. Back in the underworld, as night deepened and the last patrols returned, Issei felt it, a distant pressure, subtle but unmistakable. Not an attack, a notice. He looked at Grayfia, who met his gaze with immediate understanding. Something else is coming, he said. Yes, she replied. Not to destroy us, to test us. She placed her hand lightly over his, not possessive, not demanding, present. Whatever it is, she said, we will face it with clarity. Together, above them, the stars shifted almost imperceptibly, as if the universe itself were adjusting its focus. The war of opposition had failed. The trial of balance was about to begin, and this time, the outcome would not be decided by domination, but by whether connection itself could stand against the very concept of imposed order. It did not arrive with fire, it arrived with stillness. Across realms, across borders of divine authority and infernal dominion, something fundamental shifted, as if reality itself paused to acknowledge a higher directive. Ley lines quieted, divine artifacts fell dormant. Even ancient beings who had survived the birth of their own pantheons felt an unfamiliar sensation ripple through their existence. Inspection. Issei Hayader felt it like a hand resting gently, but firmly, on his spine. Not hostile, not benevolent, evaluative. Partner, Drake said slowly, his voice lower than Issei had ever heard it. This presence is not a god. It predates the framework gods operate within. Grayfia stood beside Issei on the highest observation platform of the underworld, her expression composed, but her senses fully extended. Her magic did not recoil from the pressure, it aligned instinctively, like a blade recognizing a whetstone. It is law, she said quietly. Or something that believes itself to be. The sky did not tear open this time. Instead, space clarified. The air ahead of them folded inward, lines straightening, colors flattening, until a figure emerged, not stepping through, but resolving into existence as though it had always been there. It had no wings, no halo, no monstrous form. It appeared humanoid only because perception required reference. Its body was composed of layered symmetry, light and shadow interlocking in perfect proportion. Its eyes held no emotion, only reflection. I am the corrector, it said, its voice neither loud nor soft, but absolute. I observe systemic deviation. Every barrier in the underworld flared automatically. The corrector ignored them. You represent convergence. It continued, gaze fixed on Issei. Power derived not from hierarchy, dominion, or sacrifice, but from mutual alignment. Issei swallowed, forcing his voice steady. If you're here to fight, get it over with. The corrector tilted its head minutely. Conflict is inefficient. I am here to assess sustainability. Grayfia stepped forward half a pace. And if your assessment deems us unacceptable, correction will occur. The word carried finality. Surzex appeared beside them, aura flaring instinctively. You speak as though free will is a variable error. It is, the corrector replied calmly. Free will introduces instability. Your bond-based power structure amplifies deviation exponentially. Issei clenched his fists. So because we don't fit your system, you want to erase us? No, it said. Erasure is crude. Reversion is preferable. Reality shifted. Suddenly, Issei was no longer standing on the platform. He was remembering. He saw himself at the beginning, weak, desperate, craving affection without understanding it. He felt the pain of betrayal, the terror of death, the rage of inadequacy. Around him, visions unfolded. Timelines where his bonds fractured, where power consumed him, where love turned possessive, where the underworld burned because emotional convergence collapsed under strain. You see potential failure, the corrector said. Your model lacks guarantees. Then Grayfia was pulled into it. She saw herself alone, forever composed, eternally controlled. She saw futures where she suppressed her emotions again, became perfect once more, and watched as the underworld stagnated under rigid order. She saw other futures, where she chose Issei without balance, where obsession replaced discipline, where her power annihilated everything she sought to protect. Her breath caught. Issei felt it instantly, not through magic, through connection. No, he said aloud, forcing himself back into the present. You're wrong. The corrector turned its gaze to him. Explain. Issei stepped forward, aura steady, not explosive, not defensive. You're looking for certainty, he said. For outcomes that don't risk collapse. But growth doesn't work like that. Grayfia joined him, her voice calm but unyielding. Stability imposed without choice becomes decay. The corrector paused. That alone was unprecedented. Our bonds don't eliminate risk, Issei continued. They share it. When one of us falters, the others compensate, not because they're forced to, but because they choose to. You cannot quantify choice, the corrector replied. Grayfia's eyes hardened. Then your system is incomplete. Power began to rise, not violently, not chaotically, but collectively. Across the underworld, those bound to Issei felt it. Rias. His peerage. Allies. Even those who did not love him but believed in what he represented. Not worship. Recognition. The boosted gear activated. But not into balance breaker. Something else. A state where power did not amplify strength, but clarity. Issei felt every bond like a steady anchor, not pulling him apart, but holding him together. This is sustainability, Issei said quietly. Not because it can't fail, but because when it does, it adapts. For the first time, the corrector's form fluctuated. Deviation acknowledged, it said slowly. Model revision required. The pressure lifted, not entirely, but enough for the world to breathe again. I will not correct you, the corrector continued. I will observe. With that, it dissolved, not departing, not retreating, but withdrawing from immediate relevance. Silence followed. Then Serzex exhaled sharply. I think, we just argued with the universe, Issei laughed weakly. Yeah. Wouldn't recommend it. Grayfia looked at Issei then, not as a protector, not as a catalyst, but as a partner who had faced inevitability and refused to bow. You chose uncertainty, she said softly. He nodded. Every time. Above them, the sky resumed its natural flow, imperfect and alive. The corrector had not been defeated, but it had been convinced. And that meant something far more dangerous and promising. Because if even the principles that governed reality could be forced to reconsider, then the age of imposed order was truly ending, and whatever came next would be shaped not by fear of collapse, but by the courage to connect anyway. The world did not end. That, more than anything else, was how everyone knew something fundamental had changed. Days passed after the corrector's withdrawal. Then weeks. Reality did not snap back into rigid alignment, nor did it unravel into chaos. Instead, it adjusted, subtly, unevenly, like a living thing learning a new posture after centuries of rigidity. Divine systems recalibrated. Ancient contracts lost their absolute authority. Laws that had once been enforced by inevitability now required consensus. Choice became relevant. Issei Haide felt the difference in quiet moments most of all. The pressure that had once followed him everywhere, the sense of being watched by fate itself, was gone. Not replaced by freedom without consequence, but by responsibility without predestination. For the first time, his future was not being measured. It was being allowed. In the underworld, the shift manifested politically before it ever did culturally. Councils convened not to react, but to redesign. Power blocks dissolved and reformed around cooperation rather than lineage alone. Bonds, once dismissed as liabilities, were analyzed as stabilizing vectors. What Issei and Grayfia represented was no longer an anomaly. It was a case study. Serzex Lucifer presided over the final assembly of the old era in the same hall where centuries of rigid order had once been enforced. This time, there were no wards of secrecy, no layers of imposed silence. Transparency was the message. We cannot return to what we were, Serzex said, his voice carrying calmly across the chamber. The universe itself has acknowledged that stability enforced without consent is unsustainable. Eyes turned, inevitably, to Issei and Grayfia. Grayfia stepped forward, her presence neither commanding nor withdrawn. She did not speak as a queen, nor as an arbiter. She spoke as a leader who had chosen her role. For generations, we believed control was synonymous with safety, she said. We were wrong. Control delays collapse. It does not prevent it. Only trust does that. There was no opposition, not because dissent had vanished, but because the argument had already been settled by reality itself. The final resolution passed with historic clarity. Bonds formed by consent and transparency would be recognized as legitimate power structures. Authority would be distributed, not hoarded. No individual, devil, god, or principle, would stand beyond accountability. The age of imposed hierarchy ended not with rebellion, but with agreement. Later, far from council halls and cosmic implications, Issei stood on the familiar grounds of the Grayfia estate, watching the evening settle in. Laughter drifted from inside. Life, messy, imperfect, alive, continued as it always had. Grayfia joined him without announcement. You're thinking too loudly, she said softly. He smiled. Is it that obvious? To me, she replied. They stood side by side, the distance between them comfortable, intentional. I used to believe authority meant standing above others, Grayfia said after a moment. Detached. Untouchable. Certain. And now? Issei asked. Now I understand it means standing with them, she said. And accepting uncertainty, he nodded. That still scares me sometimes. Her hand rested lightly over his. It should, she said. Fear keeps choice honest. In the weeks that followed, life settled into a new rhythm. Not simpler, but clearer. Grayfia moved freely between roles, advisor, protector, partner. She no longer hid behind duty, nor abandoned it. She redefined it. Issei trained, not to surpass gods, but to remain worthy of the trust placed in him. His power did not spike dramatically. It stabilized. Refined. When he fought with intent rather than excess. The boosted gear no longer demanded growth through strain. It evolved through alignment, and far beyond mortal and immortal realms alike, the corrector observed. It did not intervene. It did not correct. It recorded. Patterns emerged that defied prior models. Systems that allowed choice corrected themselves more efficiently than those that enforced compliance. Bonds distributed failure rather than magnifying it. Collapse became localized, recoverable. Sustainability through connection. An equation once deemed impossible. Back in the underworld, as a new era quietly took root, Issei and Grayfia stood together beneath a sky no longer burdened by inevitability. We didn't win, Issei said quietly. Grayfia shook her head. No. We chose. That choice echoed outward, not as command, not as doctrine, but as permission. To love without surrendering agency. To lead without domination. To build power that did not require someone else to kneel. The universe did not applaud. It adapted. And that, more than any victory, was proof that what they had created was real and enduring. The story did not end there. But for the first time, it no longer needed to be written by fear. The underworld was quieter than it had been in centuries. Not empty, never empty, but calm in a way that had nothing to do with enforced order or fear of reprisal. Patrols moved without tension. Noble territories no longer pulsed with territorial hostility. Even the sky seemed less oppressive, its crimson hue softened by something that felt almost breathable. Grayfia Lucifuge walked through the Lucifer estate gardens alone. Once, this place had been a symbol of her role, precise, immaculate, controlled. Every stone perfectly placed. Every path designed for visibility and defense. She had spent countless nights here thinking through policy, punishment, balance. Tonight she walked without purpose. That, more than anything, marked the end of the old era. She stopped beneath a silver-leaf tree overlooking the distant lights of the Gremry territory. The sound of laughter carried faintly on the air, familiar voices, unguarded, alive. You disappeared, Issei said behind her. She did not turn immediately. She had learned she did not need to. I wanted to see if I could, she replied. He stepped beside her, hands in his pockets, posture relaxed in a way that still surprised those who remembered what he had become. Not a weapon. Not a symbol. A constant. And? He asked. I can't, she said. And I choose to return. He smiled, not wide, not boyish, but warm. They stood together in silence, watching the horizon. Grayfia felt it then, the difference between solitude and loneliness. She was alone in this moment, but not isolated. She could leave and return without losing herself. For someone who had lived centuries defined by obligation, that realization was profound. I used to believe permanence came from structure, she said quietly. From rules that could not bend. And now? Issei asked. Now I know permanence comes from people who stay, she replied. Even when they are not required to. He glanced at her, expression softening. You stayed. Yes, she said. I did. There was no dramatic declaration. No binding ritual. No need for the world to witness it. The bond between them was not loud. It was stable. In the weeks that followed, Grayfia's presence became something natural rather than notable. She advised when needed. She fought when necessary. She withdrew when appropriate. No longer defined solely as Lucifer's queen, nor reduced to anyone's possession. She was acknowledged as Issei's partner, not because of power, but because of choice. And Issei, in turn, changed in ways few noticed at first. He became more deliberate. Less reactive. He listened more than he spoke. When conflicts arose, he did not rush to the front unless needed. Leadership no longer meant carrying everything alone. It meant trusting that he didn't have to. One evening, as the household settled into rest, Grayfia found Issei on the roof, lying back and staring at the stars. They look different, he said. They always have, she replied, sitting beside him. You simply notice now, he laughed softly. Maybe. They lay there in companionable silence. I don't know what the future holds, Issei said after a while. I don't think anyone does anymore. Grayfia turned her head slightly, silver hair catching the starlight. That is not a flaw. No, no, she said. It is an invitation. He considered that, then nodded. I like that. Far beyond them, systems adjusted. Observers recorded. Principles recalculated. But none of that intruded on the moment. For the first time in her long existence, Grayfia Lucifuge was not preparing for collapse, betrayal, or correction. She was simply living in a present she had chosen, and that, she knew, was the truest form of power she had ever held. Rias Gremory had always believed she understood love. As a noble devil, she had grown up surrounded by political marriages, strategic alliances, and expectations disguised as romance. When she chose Issei Hayadu, she believed she had already defied that world, chosen passion, loyalty, and genuine affection over convenience. What she had not expected was growth beyond jealousy. She stood in the Gremory household's inner courtyard, watching the late evening lights flicker to life. The estate felt fuller now, not louder, not chaotic, but anchored. People moved with purpose, smiles came more easily. Even the magic in the air felt less tense. Change had settled in. At first, it had frightened her. She would not lie to herself about that. There had been moments, quiet, private ones, where doubt crept in. Moments where she wondered if sharing meant losing something irreplaceable. If opening the circle wider would thin what she and Issei had built from the start. But time, honesty, and proximity had answered those fears better than any reassurance ever could. Rias turned as footsteps approached. Grayfia Lucifuge stopped a respectful distance away. Not imposing. Not hesitant. Equal. Issei is still training, Grayfia said calmly. He loses track of time when he's thinking. Rias smiled faintly. That sounds like him. They stood together for a moment, silence stretching, not awkward, not forced. I once thought you were untouchable, Rias admitted. An ideal. Something distant. Grayfia inclined her head slightly. I was designed to be, and now? Rias asked. No, Grayfia replied. I am learning how to be present. Rias looked at her then, not as a rival, not as a superior, but as someone who had given up certainty to stand on equal ground. That couldn't have been easy, Rias said. It wasn't, Grayfia agreed. But neither was choosing him for you. That surprised Rias. You chose him long before I did, Grayfia continued. You chose his flaws, his recklessness, his humanity. I respected that, even before I understood it. Rias exhaled slowly. I was afraid, she admitted. Not of you. Of myself. Of becoming small by sharing. Grayfia met her gaze. Have you? Rias considered the question carefully. No, she said at last. I've become stronger, not louder, not dominant, stronger in the quiet sense, the kind that didn't require proving itself. From the training grounds, Issei's laughter echoed faintly, carried on the air. Rias felt warmth bloom in her chest. He doesn't belong to me, she said softly. And somehow, that makes what we share feel more real, not less. Grayfia nodded once. Love that survives choice is resilient. Later that night, Rias found Issei resting on the steps outside, towel draped over his shoulders, expression thoughtful. You okay? She asked, sitting beside him. Yeah, he said. Just thinking. She leaned against him, familiar, grounding. That's new, he laughed. Blame all of you. She smiled, then spoke seriously. Whatever happens next, whatever this world turns into, I'm still here. Not because I have to be. Because I want to be. He looked at her, eyes softening. That means everything. Rias leaned her head against his shoulder, watching the stars shimmer faintly above the underworld. She realized then that love had not become diluted. It had become layered. Trust on top of desire. respect on top of passion, choice on top of destiny, and in that layering, something enduring had formed, stronger than possession, deeper than exclusivity. The future was uncertain, but Rias Gremory no longer feared that, because she was not standing alone. Morning in the Gremory household no longer began with alarms or tension. It began with noise. Asia's soft humming drifted down the hall as she prepared breakfast, the scent of warm bread and tea following close behind. Aquino's laughter echoed shortly after, teasing, deliberate, entirely unrepentant, while Kaneko padded silently through the corridor, already awake, already judging everyone else for not being so. Issei Hyatt awoke to sunlight instead of urgency. That alone felt like a victory. He sat up slowly, rubbing his face, listening to the life unfolding around him. For a long time, mornings had meant training schedules, emergency briefings, or the lingering sense that something terrible was about to happen. Now they meant choice. He dressed casually and stepped into the common room, immediately greeted by familiar chaos. "Good morning, Issei-san," Asia said brightly, placing a cup in his hands before he could respond. "You're late," Kaneko said flatly, sipping milk. "I was thinking," he replied weakly. Aquino leaned in from behind, resting her chin on his shoulder. "How dangerous!" He laughed, tension dissolving easily. From the doorway, Grayfia observed the scene. Once she would have stood apart, evaluating, measuring, ensuring order. Now, she watched with something softer in her expression. Not indulgence, recognition. This was what stability looked like when it wasn't enforced. Rias joined her, arms folded loosely. "Still strange?" she asked. Grayfia considered the question honestly. "Yes," she said. "But no longer uncomfortable." They entered together, neither leading nor following. Conversations adjusted naturally. No one stiffened. No one yielded space unwillingly. Boundaries were respected because they were understood, not because they were feared. Later that day, during training, Issei noticed something that would have terrified him once. No one pushed him. They trained with him, not around him, not beneath him. Corrections were given freely. Weaknesses were acknowledged without judgment. Power rose and fell in rhythm rather than competition. Grayfia stepped in only once, offering a small adjustment to his stance. "Don't brace," she said quietly. "Trust your center." He did. The difference was immediate. Afterward, as the sun dipped low and the household settled into evening calm, Issei found himself on the balcony again, this time not alone. Asia sat nearby, feet tucked beneath her, peaceful. Aquino leaned against the railing, watching the sky. Kaneko rested against Issei's side without comment. Rias stood close, familiar and steady. Grayfia joined them last. No announcement, no ceremony, just presence. "This feels normal," Issei said after a while. Aquino smiled knowingly. "Normal is relative." Grayfia looked out over the underworld, eyes thoughtful. "Normal is earned." Issei glanced at her. "Do you ever miss the old certainty?" She considered it. "No," she said. "Certainty without choice is comfort without meaning." He nodded slowly. As night settled fully, lights blooming across the city below, Issei felt something profound. Not power, not destiny, not expectation. Belonging. Not ownership, not obligation. Belonging built from mutual decision, renewed every day without force. The world beyond them would continue to change. New systems would rise. Old powers would resist. Freedom would create challenges no prophecy could anticipate. But here, now, what they had built held. Not because it was unbreakable, but because everyone present chose to maintain it. And that, Issei realized, was the strongest foundation of all. Freedom did not arrive with celebration. It arrived with uncertainty. In the months following the restructuring of supernatural order, the world did not fracture, but it did not settle either. Systems once bound by rigid hierarchy now relied on negotiation. Ancient treaties were rewritten in language that allowed interpretation. Power, once absolute, became contextual. For some, this was progress. For others, it was intolerable. Issei Hyatt learned this lesson not in battle, but in silence. Reports came in from across territories, localized conflicts with no clear aggressor, alliances dissolving without hostility, divine constructs failing not from sabotage but from indecision. Authority that had once enforced peace now hesitated, unsure where legitimacy truly lay. choice had created space. And in that space, something new was growing. Grayfia Lucifuge read the compiled intelligence without visible reaction, but her eyes lingered on patterns others missed. "This is not rebellion," she said calmly, setting the data slate down. "It is drift." Rias leaned forward. "Drift toward what?" "Toward meaning," Grayfia replied. "Without imposed order, factions are attempting to define themselves. Some will adapt. Others will try to manufacture certainty." Issei frowned. "That doesn't sound good." "It isn't," Grayfia agreed. "Manufactured certainty always seeks an enemy." As if summoned by the observation itself, the alarm wards flared, not violently, not urgently, but insistently. A request for audience, flagged beyond normal priority. The origin was unfamiliar, not demonic, not divine, not fallen. The entity manifested in the outer hall without resistance, its presence restrained but deliberate. It appeared humanoid, cloaked in layered symbols that shifted depending on who observed them. "I represent the Concord of Null," it said evenly. "We request dialogue with the Red Dragon Emperor." Issei stepped forward instinctively. "About what?" "About boundaries," the envoy replied. "Your model has removed inevitability from the system. Some of us believe inevitability is necessary." Grayfia's gaze sharpened. "And you intend to restore it?" "No," the envoy said. "We intend to replace it." The words settled heavily in the chamber. Rias crossed her arms. "With what?" "Consensus enforced by absence," the envoy replied. "A system where deviation simply disappears." Issei felt a chill crawl up his spine. "That's not freedom. That's erasure." The envoy inclined its head. "That is efficiency." Grayfia stepped forward, her aura pressing outward just enough to make the message clear. "You are standing here because we allowed dialogue," she said. "Not because your proposal is valid." "Understood," the envoy replied calmly. "Which is why we are not acting yet." "Yet," Issei echoed. "Yes," it said. "We are observing whether your model can withstand disagreement without reverting to dominance. If it cannot, others will accept our solution." With that, the envoy withdrew, its presence fading without distortion. Silence followed. "That," Issei said slowly, "might be the creepiest thing we've dealt with so far." Grayfia nodded. "Because it does not seek power. It seeks silence." That night, Issei stood alone beneath the open sky, the familiar weight of leadership pressing down in a way that felt different than before. Not heavier, sharper. Grayfia joined him quietly. "This isn't about strength anymore, is it?" he asked. "No," she replied. "It is about whether freedom can tolerate those who reject it." He looked at her. "And if it can't, then," she said evenly, "we will have to decide what lines cannot be crossed, even in a world built on choice." Issei exhaled slowly. The next era would not be defined by gods, devils, or cosmic principles. It would be defined by how much uncertainty people were willing to live with, and whether they could protect freedom without becoming the very thing they had dismantled. The test had begun. The Concord of Null did not act immediately. That restraint, more than any overt aggression, unsettled the underworld. Days passed without incident. No attacks. No ultimatums. No covert operations detected by even the most sensitive surveillance networks. On the surface, everything appeared calm, but beneath it, uncertainty spread like a slow poison. Issei Hayate felt it most during meetings. Not fear. Not hostility. Hesitation. Representatives spoke carefully now, weighing every word as though silence itself might be listening. Decisions that once would have been resolved through negotiation now stalled, not from disagreement, but from reluctance to commit. Freedom had given everyone a voice, but it had also removed the comfort of inevitability. And the Concord of Null was counting on that. "They're waiting for paralysis," Issei said quietly during a closed strategy session. "For us to stop trusting the system we built." Grayfia nodded. "They understand that freedom creates friction. They intend to weaponize discomfort." Rias frowned. "So what's their first move?" Grayfia's crimson eyes sharpened. "They will not strike us. They will strike confidence." The answer came sooner than expected. A neutral territory, once stabilized by divine arbitration, went dark. Not destroyed. Not conquered. Simply absent. All scrying failed. All signals ended at a clean boundary, as though the region had never existed. No casualties were reported. No survivors either. The message was unmistakable. They didn't kill anyone, Issei said slowly, staring at the report. They erased the decision. Grayfia folded her hands calmly. They removed disagreement. A demonstration. Within hours, fear spread faster than any invasion ever could. Lesser factions began questioning whether choice was worth the risk. Some openly advocated for a return to imposed structure. Others quietly reached out, asking what concessions might buy safety. Issei felt the weight of every one of those requests. That night, he stood alone in the training grounds, fists clenched, power deliberately suppressed. The boosted gear responded faintly, not urging escalation, but awareness. I thought freedom would make things clearer, he muttered. Grayfia approached without sound, stopping a short distance away. Freedom reveals, she said. Clarity comes later. He didn't look at her. What if they're right? What if people want certainty more than choice? They may, she replied evenly. But certainty without consent becomes tyranny, no matter how efficient. Issei finally turned. And if stopping them means forcing our will? Grayfia met his gaze without hesitation. Then we must choose the least irreversible action. That answer lingered heavily between them. The next move came from an unexpected direction. A mid-tier pantheon, one that had remained neutral through every major conflict, publicly declared alignment with the Concord of Null. Not out of malice, but exhaustion. Their statement was simple. We are tired of choosing. The reaction was immediate. Fear intensified. Doubt crystallized. The underworld's newly formed councils fractured into heated debate. For the first time since the corrector's withdrawal, Issei felt the system strain, not from external pressure, but internal divergence. This is the real test, Rias said quietly. Not whether freedom can exist, but whether it can survive being rejected. Issei closed his eyes briefly. Leadership, he was learning, was not about having the right answer. It was about deciding which consequences you were willing to accept. Grayfia stepped beside him, her presence steady. They believe erasure is mercy, she said. We must show that choice, even flawed, is worth preserving. How? Issei asked. She answered without raising her voice. By refusing to erase them in return. Silence followed. That decision would cost them support. It would cost them certainty. But it would prove something the Concord of Null could not quantify. That freedom did not need to eliminate dissent to endure it. And somewhere beyond the boundaries of existence, the Concord observed, calculating, adapting, preparing to escalate, not with force, but with a question no system liked to answer. How much chaos will you tolerate, to remain free?